Alrighty then. Welcome to yet another exciting episode of the Online Prosperity Show. You know, this is the number one place where you come to learn how to turn your expertise into influence, impact, and income. And you're doing this all without feeling like you're shouting into the void. I'm your host, Prosper Taruvinga. And if you've maybe ever felt like you're doing everything right, especially if you're a leader in your capacity right now, but something is just not landing with the team or the people that you are leading, then I think today's episode is going to be the one that's going to hit it home for you. Because what if the problem isn't your strategy, but the way the leadership is actually experienced? So I think this is what our guest today has spent over 30 years trying to figure out, and he's going to be helping us out to decide whether our leadership is actually impacting others or we are just spraying and praying to the ones that are around us. Now, Crispin, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. Happy to be here. And yeah, I think we have a lot of things we can cover today.
Well, absolutely. I've heard you spent nearly 30 years in the trenches, of high level tech leadership. And you've just realized that maybe success isn't just about what you do, but how people actually feel. And I think there's statements and words and quotes that say people don't necessarily remember what you say, they remember how you make them feel. And I think that goes along what it is that you have discovered. So, and I understand now you're helping leaders bridge what you call the perception gap. And for those that are watching right now, we are going to be bridging that for you as well, because that's the space between intention and impact. Now, Chris, I could go on and talk about things that are not even, in my wheelhouse or I'm qualified to talk about. Tell us a little bit about your journey. And I mean, obviously, you spent 30 years in leadership and, working with Fortune 100 companies. What did that look like for you?
It didn't look like this at the beginning, that's for sure. I studied history, so this was never going to be my path, my journey. I think anything other than this probably was what I was thinking about in the beginning. And like a lot of us, maybe a little bit undirected or misdirected in the beginning of our kind of professional lives. I had a job out of school, and then I kind of went to another place that was not ever meant to be a career. It was just meant to be kind of the next place. It was better money, it was better, more like predictable hours, these sort of things. But it was still just a job in the beginning, and that ended up being a 25-year career at what ended up being Hewlett Packard, right? So I started at the bottom of the bottom, because it was, and this was a much smaller company that got acquired by a bigger company. They got acquired by Compaq. They got acquired by HP. So for me, the journey was a little bit non-linear. So looking backwards, I say it was one company for 25 years, but it was a bunch of companies, right, over a bunch of years. And I started at pretty much the entry level as an inside salesperson. So picking up the phone, making phone calls. This is back when phone calls were how you would connect with people rather than just text or emails and things. And in fact, at the beginning, our PCs didn't have direct access to the internet. That I feel very, very old when I say that. You say 30 years experience, and I think we're talking about someone else, and then I see my image and the gray in my beard, and I think about that statement I just made, and I know it's true. But I started in sales, and it was funny because I was good at sales. I was good at sales by the only objective measure, which is I cleared my quota, I made my bonus, my clients were happy, and they would call for more. But I did not enjoy selling. I didn't enjoy the kind of hunt method for that. And I had great opportunities in my career because this was tech in the mid 90s and then early 2000s. So everything was growing really, really rapidly. The opportunities were there for many if you just raised your hand and said, I want to try something different. And that's what I did. And within maybe 5 years of kind of starting in at that very entry level, I found myself living and working in Europe. I had taken a rotation. I was doing a very, very big project there, and all of these things started to shape, what was I seeing in terms of how do people lead, how do people manage? There's a difference between those two. There's this, people follow leaders because they have to, because the org chart tells them they have to listen to them, and people follow people because they feel inspired, because they feel that direction, they feel that connection. And over the course of my career, I started talking about words like being seen as genuine and authentic, because that to me felt like the apex of what does success begin to look like as a leader. All the other business objectives and milestones, come along with that. But if your team believes in you, if they believe that you're connected with them, that you can see them, they can see you, that there's a good bilateral way to connect and be connected there, then a lot of really, really good things start to happen. And what I started to realize is, as I matured in my career and I kind of moved into executive roles and things, that I started to have a real passion for the initially I just sort of thought of as paying it forward, because what I would see is people start to maybe not even make the same mistakes that I had made in my career, but just about to. And I would intervene and I would say, hey, don't do that. I've already done that, and you don't want to do that. And then that ultimately started to become the basis for what and how I coach. I think as a root to a lot of the ways I coach, it goes back to some failure that I had or I witnessed in my own career. And so I started kind of taking on people that I would coach, and I would act as a mentor or an executive sponsor to some program within the company. And I really felt energy from this, enough energy that I was doing this kind of I used to call it my work hobby, like a side thing in addition to my regular responsibilities. And I think uh, probably true, and probably a bit of an ego stroke for me as well, as I started having people telling me maybe this is what you should do. And even though I think I was pretty good at what I did as a leader at HP, and then after that, this was always a thing that really, really got me excited. And it got me excited not just because I could see people grow, which is amazing to me, and not just because I felt like I was helping to kind of enable the next generation of leaders, but also an ownership stake, right? Because what I do, how we do it at the Leadership Studio is all mine. There's no one who can point to it and say you're screwing it up because you're not doing it right. It's If I screw it up, it's because I'm not doing it right. So it's based on however I felt in that moment, or how do I see things. I try to be very adaptive to the moment, and how do we build that on. So kind of from where I was to where I am, the journey was kind of watching, being inspired by great leaders, having good mentors myself along the way, get in my ear, sometimes bluntly, sometimes softly, but steer me toward being better tomorrow than I was today. And that's become, just a big mantra for me. Just be better today than you were yesterday, be better tomorrow than you are today. And if we can put ourselves, no matter the discipline, but my focus obviously is around how do we lead and connect. But if we can just put ourselves on a path of continuous improvement, I think it's such an amazing journey. And then as leaders, it keeps us from doing things like over focusing on perfection, which is largely unattainable, but such a bad word when we start to think about, like, if I put a big heavy premium on communication in leaders, right? If we can connect, like, because we use words and stories and all these things to connect as humans, if we can connect with our audience, whether that's a C-suite or whether it's employees across the world, then we're not starting at zero, right? We're starting so far down the road. But if I focus on everything's got to be perfect every time, then the instant some inevitable thing happens, I sneeze or I say the wrong thing or some word just comes out of my mouth wrong, as it does sometimes, then that gets in my head. And then I'm thinking, oh, well, shoot, now it's not 100, now it's a 95, now a 95 becomes a 90. And I start thinking about that thing I did wrong versus thinking about, is this message even landing? Are they resonating? Do they feel seen? Do they feel heard? Do they feel connected? And over focusing on myself and some trivial thing just becomes this crack that becomes a chasm that becomes this big wide, canyon that we can't cross anymore. So a lot of words there to kind of talk about the journey from hither to thither, but that's kind of how I got inspired to do a lot of these things.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, obviously, we could just end here, but you've just raised a lot of questions now, and I just wanted to take us back a little bit. Thank you so much for giving us this sort of outline, which then obviously gives us, some sort of path for us to then follow. Now, Crispin, you mentioned that obviously this leadership path was not even in your horizon when you were sort of growing up and things like that. Was there an aspiration, like something you wanted to do as a kid? I know some boys would want to be a fireman, a policeman, or things of that nature. Was it something like that
When
that
I was Sorry, not to cut you off. When I was a child, I think I went through phases, and my phases were not the typical I want to be a fireman, I want to be a policeman or whatever. I was a nerd, I think. I was very science oriented, and I would just consume knowledge. And this, of course, is back in the days of encyclopedias and things like that, but I would consume knowledge on a specific topic. So I would go through a phase where I just wanted to know everything there was to know about birds, and decided I was going to be an ornithologist, or I was going to be a primatologist, or all these things that I very, very focused on science. My family has a strong military background, and aviation had always interested me, and I became really fixated on, I wanted to be in the Navy. I wanted to go to the Naval Academy. I wanted to be a pilot. This was my pathway. There's a pretty precise process on how to do that in the United States, and suffice it to say, it didn't work for me. And it was funny because at the time, of course, I'm 17, 18 years old, graduating high school, and for quite some time, this had been the focus. And then it became obvious that was not going to happen. And then the Navy still wanted me. They came to me and talked to me about some different options, but I was 18 and pissed off. Right. So it was, if it can't be the way I wanted, it's not going to happen. And so it sort of put me on this other pathway of, let's do something different. Let's go focus on, just things I love. So history, and then it was just like, how do I make some money? And not to be like completely focused on kind of tangible things, but you need a car, you need a place to live, like you need things. And then again, I think a little bit of luck, I think a little bit of ambition, I would hope a little bit of talent. These things kind of conspired together to propel my career in the beginning, and I began to see opportunities. I think when I left to go to Europe, I didn't have a passport, right? I knew this project was coming up. I had gone and talked to my boss's boss, and I said, the next person you send, I want it to be me, and here's why. And I made a big case. And I remember being so nervous about that, because I really, really wanted it. Probably it was the first thing I had really, really wanted in that way in a long time. And I felt like I was really out over my skis. I was really extended beyond, because a lot of that at that point, none of us really had any idea what we were doing, because it was kind of building a new model for the company. And I think I did a good job selling, because they said yes. And then they said, oh, you're going to go in 2 weeks. And I said, I don't have a passport. That's probably an issue. And this was pre 9/11. So I was able to rush through a process. I had to get my company to write a letter. I went to a physical office, and then within 3 hours, I had a passport in my hands, like that. Like, so it was crazy, crazy, crazy. I don't know that that's even doable in modern life. And then it was funny, because originally I was supposed to go to Germany, and then 3 days before I left, they said, no, we're going to start you in the UK, which was good, because I don't speak German. Now I ended up in Scotland, where the English was really hard to understand in the beginning anyway. So it was, maybe the German would have been better for me. But this whole thing about, that's when I started to kind of see, okay, if I ask for something, then and I kind of make the pitch, then there's some chance it can happen. In fact, later in my career, I began to use a phrase that you almost never get what you don't ask for, and that became a mantra for me. And I had a pretty harsh lesson. That's why that particular phrase came out. But that I began to see that there's classic ways of saying this, like nothing ventured, nothing gained, right? And I started to kind of be willing to put myself out there, be willing to ask for things, and be willing to try to make a bet on myself. And more often than not, I think they paid off, and I'd like to think that they paid off for the company as well. And
Absolutely.
yeah, and it became foundations for how I saw leadership, how I see myself, how I would want others to see myself, how it become the foundations for how I do things today in my life and my professional life as well.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for that. Now, Crispin, you keep reverting back to the subject of history as one of the core things that you quite remember, obviously in your school days and things like that. Do you think studying history would have actually prepared you for a lot of leadership? And hear me out here a little bit, because in history, there's a lot of study of people that have actually succeeded in certain things and people that have failed. And there's also another distinction where you learn so much of the different types of leadership. There's what we call wartime leaders, people that are
Mhm.
leading when bullets are flying or arrows are flying and things of that nature. And then there's also peacetime leaders. Those are two different types of leadership. Now, do you think history would have actually prepared you, not necessarily learning about the Civil War or Napoleon Bonaparte, but just leadership in and of itself?
I'll say a couple things. I'll say for a long time in my career, I used it as a punchline, like I'm not meant to be here, this sort of thing. But the reality is the the kind of shaping of different styles. And again, it wasn't what I was aiming to do in the beginning, but this notion that communication is such a foundational element to how we engage and how does engagement create leadership. For sure, it helped. But where it really helped was after I had kind of moved into executive levels and I started having people that I was leading that were not just in front of me, so not just US based, but truly global. And there I really do think it helped because having a little bit of knowledge about the history of a place and particularly maybe the cultural history of a place helped me engage, and not just in small talk, not just like, oh, I know this thing happened, but if I was seeing kind of macro dynamics, like in general, we would make a generality about, oh, this office is easy or this office is tough or whatever the thing was. Me internalizing that, dissecting a little bit, kind of thinking about making a hypothesis, basically saying, okay, this country is this way because in the last 50 years, 100 years, it was that way, and thinking about their own kind of cultural journey. And I do think it helped me. I do think it helped me connect. It changed my style in different countries. There's a thing that I talk about in my professional life now is that there's kind of three communications basics. There's voice, which is like what do you do to be the most well received and confident. There's persona, which is how are you tailoring your message to the audience. And then there's focus, which is how much are you putting in front of them? Can they even consume what you're trying to put out there? But that middle piece, that persona piece, that adapting what you say and how you say it to the audience, that really was born out of those pieces there. Trying to connect, trying to deliver the same message in the same way when your audience is in China and in India and in Eastern Europe and in Mexico proved to be kind of fruitless. I needed to make a hybrid a little bit of the way I would engage them, the way I would speak, how I would solicit or anticipate feedback, the bluntness or lack of bluntness in that feedback. If I really wanted blunt feedback, I had to be very careful about how I asked in certain places just because of their willingness or unwillingness to challenge authority. And I do legitimately think that my knowledge, my understanding, my willingness to kind of think about, maybe not just what happened yesterday, but what had happened 20, 30, 40 years ago, I do think that really did help me. And then of course back to your notion of like wartime versus peacetime leaders, I think about there's different archetypes we have as communicators and as leaders, and there are times when I would say, generally speaking, I don't want the drill sergeant as a leader, but you need it once in a while. And I think as leaders, really effective leaders have to be able to understand what is it they're seeing in front of themselves. So if the bullets are flying, you don't need kumbaya, right? You need the person who can and will make a decision and is willing to stand by the decision. And by the way, if that decision is wrong, it's okay. We have to move on. We have to know why it was wrong, but we be willing to kind of keep charging, keep moving forward. And then we have to understand that because not everyone is easily accepting of that kind of drill sergeant mentality, we have to understand what's likely going to come after this. So if we're in a hyper tense, revenue down, whatever situation, and we have an emergency, we need to act accordingly. But when that time has passed, people are going to feel a little shell shocked. They're going to feel that this was tough and we acted in ways that maybe were outside of our character. And how do we kind of renormalize those things? So there's a lot of, I think a lot about emotional intelligence and how do we create those empathetic links and ties, and that comes out across too. And I'm anyone who knows me knows I'm always willing to pull out like a World War II analogy or Civil War analogy, whatever it is, to kind of talk those things through as well.
Oh, absolutely. And I like how you say it allows you to have some in-depth understanding of why people react the way that they do. Because,
Mhm.
yeah, certain languages, certain cultures are the way they are based on, maybe the hierarchy or just the way the country is actually set up. And the fact that you would have maybe then gone to England and experienced that. What that also does is it showcases that these places have been in existence long enough, not just because you've seen them and you think you've discovered these areas. And it just gives you a certain humility around certain things. And when you go into a new place or you're studying a new civilization, you are by definition a rookie. And you just started off, as you mentioned, in the trenches as a
Mhm.
salesperson, which basically allowed you to see both sides of leadership. How much of an advantage did that sort of give you? Because some people just start off with an MBA, right? And they think whatever they're being taught in whatever school is going to be directly transferable in their leadership, whereas you were on the receiving end at some point.
I think first of all, I'll be the first to say there's no one perfect path, right? I think whether it was you came out of B school and it was an amazing program, or you grew up from the bottom up, I don't think there's any one perfect path. But you used words there that I really liked. So you talked about humility. You talked about the kind of thinking about yourself as a rookie. And I think if no matter the path, no matter where you are, if you can kind of recenter yourself and think about a few things. First of all, I think we should always be humble. And the instant that we aren't, the universe will humble us, right? It will show us why we should have been in the first. At least I hope so. Every once in a while, hubris wins out, and more so than we would like. But in the end, I think things get balanced. But that notion of being a rookie, meaning you're there to learn, you're there to be successful, I think is really a great mentality, whether you're a brand new people leader or whether you're a senior vice president or a C whatever. Because I think the instant that we say, I have nothing else to learn, we also have very little else to teach, right? Because the each generation is different. I'm a Gen X guy, right? But each generation, successive generation after that is learns different, sees things through the world different. I didn't, like I said, I had encyclopedias and not the internet. So everything's shaped differently. And then add into that all the cultural things, right? So what country you lived in, how were you taught, how all those things matter. And if we're not as leaders, if we're not willing to be humble, and I think to be honest, one of the things I always want to say when I'm a leader of any organization is that I'm grateful for the opportunity. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be your leader, to be accepted as, because I think gratitude goes a long way. My family is very Southern. I use this in a talk another day when I said I grew up in a household where please and thank you were not optional. So I think gratitude goes a long way, and it helps connect. But again, if you come in saying I have all the answers, or you come in and say thou shalt listen to me because the org chart shows me above you, yeah, some people will listen to you, or maybe everyone will listen to you, but no one's going to follow, right? No one's going to follow by when things get tough. that does not last, right? They when things are tougher than normal, or something unexpected occurs, or some tragic event, right? That's when you need the leader who has shown themselves able to connect, to again to have emotional intelligence, and understand empathetically what's the right way to engage as a human, and how do we keep those connection points in order to create long-term success. Because the other side of this too is we emulate what we see as success. And so the other side of this is that if I've talked, I have a more colorful phrase, but I'll use the cleanup one: talented jerks, right? So if you have talented jerks in an organization that are promoted, that are seen as successful, well, guess what? The whole organization then becomes jerks, because the everyone will see this was what was rewarded, this was what was expected, whether they're thinking about it actively or not. Passively, they're consuming this approach, and they're saying, oh, well, that's what they want, is the person that yells and screams and pounds the desk and berates people, and that's what I'll do. And then suddenly the whole culture of an organization begins to collapse, and you'll have reciprocity and retaliation and things that you just never ever want in a successful organization. When if you had just started out with, I'm here to lead, but I want to learn, what a great place to start, right? Because then you're creating these engaging things. And if you can show that you maybe have great ideas, but the important is the collective great idea, then people will feel engaged and want to follow, more than just having to be told what to do.
Absolutely. I like that. And I like the statement that you mentioned that, you obviously start off by saying you're grateful for the opportunity, because
Hmm.
I viscerally believe it is a gift to be able to, be put in front of people that are on their journey going somewhere. And if you have an
Yeah.
opportunity to be influencing those kind of people, I mean, you should actually take that as an opportunity. And like you said, it's an opportunity for you to actually learn and
Hmm.
impact and things of that nature. But earlier on, there's a statement that you sort of alluded to where you said there's leading versus managing. And I wanted you to maybe just touch up on that. What does that
Hmm.
actually mean, and what is this in the context of what we're talking about today?
So to be a good manager, you can learn that from a class, or from a book, or from your company. That's managing to task. That's making sure that work is done, that the kind of basic processes and mechanics are followed. But at its core, it's more tactical, right? You're talking about, we're delivering X, we have these people or these devices or AI or whatever the thing is these days, but that's how this work is getting done. Leading is making sure everyone knows why we're doing this, right? So it's kind of helping set the vision. It's aligning people around, why are we doing this? What matters, beyond just that your job description says you have to do this. Let's create some degree of inspiration, so we can say we're doing this to help this part of the company, or this, we're making the world better by doing this. But let's tap into more of the how, sorry, the why we're doing this, and then you start to talk about the how, right? Because and then you have good managers to kind of go and execute against that. But if you lack the person or persons at the top who can help articulate what's the reason that we're here, how do we set the strategy around this, then you can only ever do step change, right? You can never really be truly transformative. You can't, there might be a little bit of a curve of improvement, but you're unlikely to ever get to, what is the end phase. And to be honest, you might not know what the end phase is, right? Because you're unwilling or unable to articulate that. And it's funny, when I first when I first was promoted to an executive role at AHP, my boss at the time had a lot of these little aphorisms and sayings and kind of blunt things. And one of the things that would hit us sometimes is if he would pick up the phone and call us and say, "Listen, you're managing too much and leading too little." Because each of us at an executive level, we had people beneath us who were there to deliver, who were there to deliver the work, but they weren't the people who could help make sure the organization knew why we were there, or help stay connected, or you know connect us to other parts of the business, or translate our work into something that a more senior executive would care about. And that's, especially in a big company, right? There's a lot of that connection points that are really, really critical to the big success, because we start talking about words like stakeholders, like people that maybe aren't in our direct business, but they care. Maybe they care with money about what we're doing and how we do it. And if we can't keep them engaged, if we can't keep them feeling knowledgeable and empowered and connected to us, then that sponsorship or that funding goes away, and then we have a whole other problem to deal with. So keeping us as executives focused on how do we charge and recharge our organizations? How do we help, work horizontally across to other organizations? How do we keep executives and stakeholders engaged? How do we set the vision? That really became the core of how do I start to make that distinction between leadership and management.
Now, you mentioned this statement, you're managing too much and leading too little. Is that what you refer to as the perception gap?
So I think the perception gap is, so it's part of it, right? It certainly can be, and it can lead to the perception gap. So if you're a director, senior director, VP, and you find yourself in meetings and you're talking about individual widgets or individual orders, you're basically devaluing yourself. So you're creating this gap of perception between who you are and what your role really is and how people are seeing you. So that then becomes this kind of notion of the perception gap, and allowing it to go on long term then has career ramifications, right? Because you're then perceived as, maybe a doer, not a thinker, or you're perceived as maybe tactically proficient but unable to see the big picture. And it may not be true, but if you're, and I talk a lot about kind of intentional signal versus accidental noise. Are you saying what you mean to say, and is what you mean to say being heard the way in which you intend it, right? And so that then all these things together become this kind of perception gap, because there's how we want to be seen, and quite frankly, as a senior leader, there's how you need to be seen in order to be successful in your job today, let alone any other career aspirations you might have. And not taking a moment to have someone else kind of tell you how you are being perceived, or not going through steps to maybe have a self-assessment or analysis or whatever that can help expose maybe some of these things to you, is going to put you on a perpetual path of you're stuck in the same thing. People only see me one way and I don't know why. And then it becomes resentment and bitterness, and then pretty soon, no matter where you started, you become the leader that people don't want to work with, because you're frustrated with how you're perceived and unable to achieve the things you want to achieve.
I mean, obviously here, Crispin, it just sounds like your whole journey has just been about moving from you controlling outcomes to actually influencing the experiences that people actually have, from you as being a leader, and almost that your past has actually trained you in execution, but your present is now about connection. Now, most people in your space or leaders will just think, oh, the numbers are tricking well, everything looks good on the dashboards. Why should I be bothered?
Well, I think there's a few things there, because it's great, by the way, if the metrics are all green and the numbers are all there and all the arrows are pointing up and to the right, fantastic. But if that's true, then maybe that's true for everyone else too. So if you're trying to distinguish yourself in a crowded landscape, then it has to be about more than the metrics and the arrows and how, like, those things, how they are. And then you start to get into, what's the story that we need to tell? How does what we just accomplished with a green dashboard and up into the right metrics, how does that relate back to what the business at large is trying to do? Or how does that help me or my own organization begin to achieve our own career goals? So, said differently, if you are happy as can be in your current role with no career aspirations ever beyond where you are, then just being happy with that, and why bother, could be fine. Now, the downside of just being happy where you are is it's going to begin to kind of make the people that you're leading yourself stuck as well, because they're also tied to those same things. And if you're not trying to connect that to a broader piece, if you're not taking the effort to really, sell yourself, the story, the organization, then they themselves will also miss out on opportunities to be perceived differently. So by kind of allowing this perception gap to occur, you're actually forcing it upon others around you as well, and not giving them the tools to kind of advance themselves. I talked before about kind of paying it forward. I think that one part of being a good leader is developing those around you. Has to be. And the reason I say has to be, by the way, is that none of us are great at everything. And a good leader has to be aware of his or her blind spots, and where we are weak or where we are blind, we should build teams around us that fill those gaps, right? The I know what I'm good at, and I know that if I'm not good at something at this point in my career after 30 years, then there's a good chance that either I'm incapable of being good at that, or I don't care enough about it to invest myself into being good at that. So I need to make sure that I have people, around me that I put on my own team that not just help cover that gap, but then create that from being an exposure, a negative exposure for the organization at large. And again, if you're just happy with I deliver what I deliver, then you're probably not taking any sort of introspective look to look at where else should I be focusing? How else do I improve those around me? How do I uplift the team around me and connect with them as well?
Now you'd understand you're talking about, weaknesses or strengths and things that maybe, like you say, blind sides. Isn't that, why we now have AI to just tell us all of those things that are missing, and show us how to write the best emails to people and keep moving and, get our numbers up.
I think so. I'll talk slightly out of both sides of my mouth on this topic. So for sure, I'm a believer in AI, and I will be the first to admit that without AI, I could not run my business. I would be spread too thin. There are things that it does for me and we have our own AI tools, right? So I have to be an advocate for it, right? So we have our own things. But the other side is that first of all, I think too few people understand with a lot of the AI tools, the popular AI tools that are in front of us, too few people understand what's the right way to get the right thing out of it. And the other way to say that is many of these tools, Gemini, Claude, ChatGPT, whatever, they are effusive in their praise. We ask it a question, we give it a topic, and it's like, wow, you are spot on. You're amazing. That's the best thing ever. And so if we're looking for a gap to be closed or a weakness to be exposed to us, that's not likely to happen, right? It's like I'm awesome. ChatGPT just told me I am, right? The $1 trillion AI just affirmed my own ego, and so that's not going to help us. The other side of this is again, unless we're willing to kind of ask the right question, give it the right prompt, then the output. I think these days the output still feels easily identifiable as AI. And I just saw an example last night, working with someone who was saying they were looking for some help and some coaching on how to frame a topic, and a person they were leading had presented something that was obviously written by AI, and nothing was particularly wrong with it, but it didn't feel like it was meant to be read by humans, right? It felt like it was too jargon filled, and it didn't sound like the way people talk. And I think you're right. Now what we're seeing is too much of that. Now a year from now, a month from now, 10 years from now, who knows where AI is going to go, and the things that, as we're starting to see these tools have the ability and capability to become more proactive and lean in, then that's a different conversation. But I think today, right now, I think we as humans have a role to play to make ourselves better, to drive connection, to connect. This didn't come before, but I wrote a book. I wrote a book specifically about this, that where it's called The Human Advantage, and it's emotional intelligence in the age of AI. Right? It's specifically about right now when we have so much transformation coming at us, all of us, by the way, not just people that work in tech, every single person, every single industry, every consumer or professional, whatever. It's we're being bombarded by AI from every direction, and I think it's easy. It's an easy thing right now to over rotate, to lean too much on artificial intelligence tools and lose our humanity. And then you end up with things that feel sterile, things that feel like maybe it came from a robot, and then worse yet, we started having a robot that wrote the email, and then you have ChatGPT or Copilot respond back, and now you've got robots talking to robots, and what value did we provide as people? And then I feel like I'm on a soapbox now, but the last thing I'll say is we still have the problem with AI. They use the term hallucinating, right? And the real term is lying, right? Making stuff up, right? And until that can be solved, or we can accurately identify this is not real, then we have real risk, right? Because we could wind up making decisions based on a recommendation that was built on nothing, right? And that's still a real risk. So I think in the moment right now, I'm all in on AI, but humans still have a very, very important role to play to make sure that we're still connecting, that we still have like one of the great things that a leader can do with his or her folks is say, how are you today? And then actually care about the response, right?
Mm.
Take that in, learn from it, make and adapt to what's next, right? If we're dealing with someone and we realize that they've had something really really amazing or really really not amazing happen in their lives, their personal lives, that should inform us. That should influence what do we say next? What do we do next? How do we do that next, right? And the machines aren't doing that for us just yet. So I think
Absolutely.
we have to be people.
I like how you frame that, because every time you type into any LLM, it praises you so much that you literally just have to walk off that ego. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Whether it's the right thing or it's a wrong thing. But obviously, you've come through, like you've mentioned, all these different technologies. You did mention the encyclopedia. You did mention the actual phone. You were picking up the phone, and I feel like you've got a large enough timestamp, to be the person that's actually ushering this next phase of leadership. Because I think a lot of people are really confused as to what they should be doing and how they should leave people feeling. So who do you help today, and what sort of transformations do your clients go through?
I think it's funny because I obviously get asked this question, like, what's the right kind of client look like for you? And for sure, I think there's a group of individuals that fit one profile more than others. But for me, it starts with leaders that want to be better. So if a leader comes to me, and whether that's a first time people leader or a very, very seasoned executive, and they come to me or they come to one of my colleagues and they say, I want to be better. I feel like my messages aren't landing, or even lately, I feel like I've got a good handle, but AI is starting to creep in, and I'm unwilling. How do I adapt in this moment? And so it has to start with I want to be better, because if I have to force change upon you, we know it's not going to happen at least easily. So if we can start with leaders that want to be better, and for sure the sweet spot I think for us is maybe established managers that are moving into executive roles, or executives that are moving into their first VP role. I think it's one of the sweeter spots for us, because I have a lot of opinions about the right ways to kind of address situations that are likely to come up. We have built all of the tools and practical exercises and things, again, are I can root them back into things that either I've been directly involved in or I have directly seen. And so I can use real life examples. And then one of the things that we could, because we do take there's a reason we call it the leadership studio and not something else. Studios is where we practice, right? So one thing that I'm very big on is having the leaders come in and kind of talk to me about the challenge, the real world challenge that they're seeing in their own professions, their own careers, their own jobs, because it helps us lean in more one direction or another to help them get there. And we start every session with a leadership assessment that anyone can take it off our website, but we start every coaching session with a leadership assessment, which is it's a self-assessment, so it's quick and you're just kind of answering questions. And then I do use AI to score it because I don't have the time for that, but it spits out a couple of pages that says, based on what you've told me, you kind of fit into one of these archetypes. Here's your kind of primary, here's your secondary. And then the thing that I think people feel is most powerful is that it then articulates where are you likely to feel most confident, most strong? Where are you likely to shine? And then maybe where does your confidence wane? And and that's really where people have, that's it's a great first moment, first minute kind of thing because people start to realize, yes, that I see myself in those pages. This resonates with me. And again, even if they were already willing to be helped, it just cracks the door wide open. Right now they feel more seen and heard in a very safe space so they can begin to grow. And then we begin to lay foundations, and there's lots of practical exercises and such that we go through. And again, a lot of what we do is we put a very, like I said, we put a very heavy premium on communication. So a lot of what we're doing is helping leaders understand how are they perceived, and putting them in kind of forcefully putting them into different scenarios so we can begin to look at where does their confidence break. Well, if they come in with great executive presence, where does that come out from? Where doesn't it? If they have all the time in the world to prep, are they amazing? If they have no time to prep, are they amazing? Like what are we seeing along the way? And we create kind of good assessments in there to help guide us toward everything. There is a framework, but we also want everyone to feel like this was tailored enough to their own needs, that they're getting out of it what they need to be great. The phrase we always use is we want to bridge potential to performance. And I think what's really powerful in that is sometimes we're just helping the leaders understand what their potential really is. And I think I talk a lot about imposter syndrome, and especially if you're newly promoted, you why me, why now, why listen to me, and I can point to a bunch of points in my own career where I felt that intensely, and talk about how did I work through it, how can others work through it, what are some good exercises to think through, what are some good thoughts to focus on, but helping them on their own journey. And obviously you feel the animation in my voice here. This is something about which I'm very, very passionate, is kind of getting it right for the folks that we're coaching.
Oh, absolutely. And thank you so much for that. Now, for those that are obviously watching right now, where would they be able to go to on the internet, Crispin, so that they can actually maybe start on this journey? Because it does seem like it is, something that most leaders would definitely want to engage in.
Yeah, I think there's a few ways. I think we have the website, obviously, which is leadership-studio.com. That's a great way you can engage us directly there. There's, like I said, right on the main page, there's a leadership assessment that's free if anyone wants to just kind of take it and kind of see how do we treat these things at the Leadership Studio. They can also reach out to me directly, or the Leadership Studio directly on LinkedIn. I think that's the more often than not, that's how people kind of find us. They hear me on a podcast or whatever, and they find me that way. And those become the paths. And then we have a lot of different things. We do individual coaching. We will do like cohort style coaching, so a bunch of leaders at once, maybe at one company, and we can tailor programs. We're also fully verified as organizations, so we offer certifications. So we like the kind of certifications that becomes like a badge on your LinkedIn, but we can certify emerging leaders and executive presence, or more senior leaders as in executive presence. We have focus things on like how to handle tougher conversations. We can also we have a like I said, I'm passionate about emotional intelligence, so we can focus in on that. And then if a company wants to have a tailored program, we can do that as well. And like we have a like an adjunct coach. It's our AI that we call Studio Coach. So it's the AI that kind of sits between sessions. But one thing we've begun working with now is companies that maybe want something like that, but they want it rooted in maybe practices that company alone does. So we do have a way to tailor that, and then basically sell the license to companies there as well, so that they can have kind of the ongoing AI coaching that kind of leverages what the way we do things, but then doesn't stray them from here's how we do things at company X.
Absolutely, and I value that a lot, because I mean, not everyone is going to want the same sort of cookie cutter way of doing things, and maybe some companies are straddling across different countries. So obviously
Mhm.
there'll be different, leadership aspects that need to be addressed there. But I'll definitely make sure that all those links are in the show notes so that people can find their way
Awesome.
to your profiles. Now, Crispin, there's a statement that you kept repeating, or that actually stuck with me, and it's along the lines, be better today than you were yesterday. And you
Hmm.
started us off as this salesperson that obviously hated selling and didn't, obviously know what they were doing in those corridors. Obviously, from what you've said, there's been massive, massive improvement to this particular person. But what's next? Who are you becoming, since you are always becoming that better person that you're talking about?
You know, it's interesting, right? Because the other side of this is, if you could change something from your past, what would you change? And my answer there is usually nothing. And that's not because my journey has been perfect, far from it, but because I believe very, very strongly that we are all a product of our experiences. And I'm quite happy with who I am today, where I am today, that I wouldn't change things. And so this notion of be better tomorrow than you were today. So what's interesting for me now is back to being a humble leader, thinking of myself as a rookie. There's so much to learn with each successive generation that now kind of matures into those leadership pathways. And so for me, it's not just about technologies, but how do we engage? How do we engage as humans? And now that we have potentially three, four, five generations in a mixed workforce, it's even if your people are all in one country, that's just like having lots of countries now, because the Gen X grew up one way, and then millennials grew up one way, and Gen Z grew up one way, and then Gen A is growing up one way, right? So how do I adapt my own messaging so that it can be the most well received? How do I continue to think about what are the ways that if I believe that I have a message that could, would, and should be heard, but it's not resonating, how do I adapt, right? Because just like I want to coach others on how to land that, how to have that intentional signal and not accidental noise, that requires me to continuously look at myself, what's working, what's not. And that might mean that what works today doesn't work tomorrow, and vice versa too, right? So I never want to throw anything away. It's always about looking at what works and adapt. I have lots of examples in my own career where I stuck too long to a story or analogy or comparison that was not working, and failed to adapt. And so I think adaptation as a leader is where I am now, right? Because I leadership coaching is a crowded marketplace. I fully understand that, right? But I think that, what we have to offer, given that it's so rooted in real world practical experiences, that we really, again, we're not focusing on managing. It's about leading and kind of creating engagement and inspiration. I think we have a lot to offer at, what we do here, in a way that at least my response from those that have done so far is resonating. But I also want to make sure that we don't sit back, even if we have the most amazing month next month as ever, the most amazing year this year than ever. That does not mean that we have cracked the code. This is the one recipe to follow. It means we have to continue to adapt and listen. And so, I'm not a big fan of kind of going out and trying to read what's the latest thing. But you and I, in the pre of this, talked a little bit about TikTok, right? So I look at a lot of social media. I look at how do these things resonate. I look at how do messages land, and sometimes I think, oh, that's stupid, and I realize, oh, but I watch it three times. So I wanna my that initial judgment is inaccurate, right? So I have to be willing to kind of open myself to things that are new, and things that I'm uncomfortable with, because I'm not heavily present on social media because it's not my comfort zone, even though probably I should be more, right? And so I'm always looking at where can or should I be leaning in as well, and looking for others to inspire me too.
Absolutely. I absolutely treasure the time that we spent today on the call. I mean, your life story and your experience have so much value, because most of what you're now teaching is mostly rooted in lived experience.
Mhm.
And half of these things you have to have gone through it in order for you to be able to be the person standing in front of the podium, saying it back to us. So thank you so much for having gone through that journey and brought us back all these lessons from the trenches.
Thank you for having me. It's always good to have these kind of just really open, honest conversations.
Great stuff. What a conversation. I mean, if there's anything you'd want to take away from today's conversation with Crispin, I think it's this. Leadership is not what you do or what it's exactly how people experience that which you are doing out there. And in a world where maybe AI can, replicate any strategy, or you can copy and paste whatever it is that's out there, I think your humility has now become the competitive advantage. And if this episode just made you pause, maybe reflect, or even question your own leadership, I encourage you to maybe share this with somebody who's maybe leading or building or just carrying the weight of responsibility, that and they might just need to hear this story today. And obviously, if you want to go deeper with conversations like this, make sure you are subscribed to the Online Prosperity Show so you do not miss out on life-changing advice like this. And there will be links in the show notes. You want to check those out so you can find out what Crispin has been up to, so you too can have that human advantage he was talking about. Until next time, I don't know what you're going to do with this information, but I do encourage you to lead in the most human way that is possibly available to you. Bye for now.